Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the past in soothing detail to help you drift into restful sleep. I'm your host, and tonight we're embarking on a comprehensive journey through the American Revolution. In this episode, we'll examine the intricate events, the daily lives of ordinary people, and the far-reaching consequences of this pivotal moment in world history. Get comfortable, close your eyes if you wish, and let the steady rhythm of historical narrative carry you through the 18th century. There's no need to remember every detail. Simply let the words wash over you as we explore this fascinating period. If you enjoy this episode or learn something new, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel more than you may think. Part 1. The Seeds of Revolution. To understand the American Revolution, we must first travel back to the mid-1700s, to a time when 13 British colonies stretched along the eastern seaboard of North America. These colonies, from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south, were home to approximately 2.5 million people by 1775. Most were of British descent, though significant populations of Germans, Dutch, French, Scottish, Irish, and enslaved Africans created a diverse colonial society. Life in the colonies moved at the pace of the seasons. Most colonists were farmers, rising with the sun to tend crops of corn, wheat, tobacco, and rice. In the northern colonies, rocky soil and harsh winters meant smaller farms and a focus on trade and fishing. The middle colonies, blessed with fertile soil, became known as the breadbasket of America. The southern colonies developed large plantation systems, dependent on the labor of enslaved people to cultivate cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. The relationship between Britain and its American colonies had always been complex. For much of the early and mid-18th century, Britain practiced what historians call salutary neglect. This meant that while the colonies were theoretically under British control, in practice they governed themselves to a large degree. Colonial assemblies passed local laws, collected taxes, and managed daily affairs with minimal interference from London, which was 3,000 miles away across a treacherous Atlantic Ocean. This arrangement suited both parties reasonably well. The colonies provided Britain with raw materials and markets for British manufactured goods. In return, the colonists enjoyed British military protection and access to the vast British trading network. But this comfortable arrangement began to unravel in the 1760s following a costly war that would change everything. The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, lasted from 1756 to 1763. This global conflict pitted Britain and its allies against France and its allies, with major battles fought in Europe, India, the Caribbean, and North America. In North America, the conflict centered on control of the Ohio River Valley and other western territories. Both Britain and France had allied with various Native American tribes, who had their own interests in the outcome. The war was brutal and expensive. British and colonial forces fought alongside each other against French troops and their Native American allies. Young George Washington, then in his 20s, gained military experience during this conflict. The British ultimately prevailed, and the Treaty of Paris in 1763 gave Britain control of all French territory east of the Mississippi River, as well as Florida from Spain. But victory came at an enormous cost. The war had nearly doubled Britain's national debt, which stood at approximately £133 million by 1763. To put this in perspective, this was an almost incomprehensible sum for the time. British taxpayers were already heavily burdened, and the government in London began looking for ways to make the American colonies contribute to the cost of their own defence. From the British perspective, this seemed entirely reasonable. They had just fought an expensive war, partly to protect the colonists from French encroachment. They now maintained an army of approximately 10,000 troops in North America to defend the frontier and keep peace with Native American tribes. Why shouldn't the colonists help pay for this protection? But the colonists saw things differently. They had their own militias and had fought in the war themselves. Many believed they had already contributed their fair share. More importantly, they had grown accustomed to managing their own affairs and resented the idea of Parliament in London imposing taxes without their consent. The first major test came in 1764 with the Sugar Act. This law actually reduced the tax on molasses imported into the colonies, but it also strengthened enforcement mechanisms to ensure the tax was actually collected. Previously, smuggling had been widespread, and many merchants had simply avoided paying duties. The Sugar Act gave British customs officials new powers and established vice-admiralty courts to try smuggling cases without juries. The colonists grumbled, but the real explosion came the following year with the Stamp Act of 1765. This law required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and even playing cards. It was the first direct tax Parliament had ever imposed on the colonies, and it affected virtually everyone, from wealthy merchants to common labourers. The colonial reaction was swift and fierce. In Virginia, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry introduced resolutions in the House of Burgesses declaring that only Virginia's own legislature had the right to tax Virginians. In Boston, a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty organized protests and intimidated stamp distributors into resigning their positions. Throughout the colonies, people refused to use the stamps, making it impossible to conduct legal business. The most important colonial response came in the form of a theoretical argument that would echo throughout the coming years: no taxation without representation. The colonists argued that as British subjects, they had the right to be taxed only by their own elected representatives. Since they had no representatives in Parliament, Parliament had no right to tax them. This argument revealed a fundamental disagreement about the nature of representation. The British countered with the concept of virtual representation. They argued that members of Parliament represented not just their own constituents, but all British subjects everywhere, including those in the colonies. The colonists found this argument absurd. How could someone in London understand or represent the interests of someone in Boston or Charleston whom they had never met? The Stamp Act crisis was ultimately resolved when British merchants, hurt by colonial boycotts of British goods, pressured Parliament to repeal the tax. In March of 1766, Parliament reluctantly repealed the Stamp Act. The colonists celebrated, believing they had won a great victory. But on the very same day, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's right to make laws binding on the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This ominous statement suggested that the fundamental disagreement had not been resolved, merely postponed. The conflict reignited in 1767 when Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, named for Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. These laws placed duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. The revenue would be used to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges, making these officials independent of colonial assemblies that had previously controlled their pay. The colonists responded with renewed boycotts of British goods. Women played a crucial role in these boycotts, organising spinning bees to produce homemade cloth instead of buying British textiles, and brewing herbal teas instead of purchasing British tea. These activities politicised women's domestic work and gave women a significant role in the resistance movement, even though they lacked formal political rights. The boycotts were remarkably effective. British exports to the colonies fell dramatically. In some communities, those who continued to purchase British goods faced social ostracism or worse. The names of importers were published in newspapers, and crowds sometimes gathered outside their homes or businesses in intimidating demonstrations. Meanwhile, tensions were rising in Boston, where British troops had been stationed since 1768 to maintain order and protect customs officials. The presence of these redcoats, as they were called because of their distinctive uniforms, angered many Bostonians. The soldiers competed with locals for jobs during their off-duty hours, and fights between soldiers and civilians became increasingly common. On the evening of March 5, 1770, these tensions exploded in what became known as the Boston Massacre. It began with a confrontation between a British sentry and a young wigmaker's apprentice. A crowd gathered, growing increasingly hostile. They threw snowballs, ice, and oyster shells at the soldiers. The crowd pressed closer, daring the soldiers to fire. In the confusion and tension, the soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 men and wounding 6 others. The first to die was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent who had been enslaved but escaped to freedom. Also killed were Samuel Gray, a rope maker, James Caldwell, a sailor, Samuel Maverick, a 17-year-old apprentice, and Patrick Carr, an Irish immigrant. These 5 men became martyrs to the colonial cause, though the event itself was more complex than simple propaganda suggested. The soldiers were arrested and put on trial. In a move that showed the colonists' commitment to legal principles, they were defended by John Adams, a prominent patriot lawyer who later became the 2nd President of the United States. Adams believed strongly in the right to legal counsel, even for those accused of killing his fellow colonists. Most of the soldiers were acquitted, and 2 were found guilty only of manslaughter, receiving minor punishments. In April of 1770, on the same day as the Boston Massacre trial verdict, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties. They kept only the tax on tea, partly to maintain the principle that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. This created an uneasy peace that lasted for about 2 years. During this relatively quiet period, many colonists probably hoped the worst was over. They went about their daily lives, farming, trading, practicing their crafts. Children attended school or helped with family work. Women managed households, preserved food, made clothing, and raised children. Men worked their trades or farms, attended church on Sundays, and gathered in taverns to discuss politics and local affairs. But beneath the surface, organised resistance continued. In 1772, Samuel Adams in Boston established the first Committee of Correspondence, a network designed to share information about British actions and coordinate colonial responses. Soon, similar committees formed throughout the colonies, creating a communication network that would prove crucial in the years to come. The next major crisis began, appropriately enough, with tea. The British East India Company, a massive trading corporation with close ties to the British government, was facing bankruptcy in 1773. To help the company, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies and actually made their tea cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea, even with the tax included. But the colonists saw this as a trick to get them to accept parliamentary taxation. If they accepted cheap tax tea, they would be admitting Parliament's right to tax them. Colonial activists organised to prevent the tea from being unloaded and sold. In Charleston, the tea was left to rot in warehouses. In New York and Philadelphia, ships were turned back. In Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to let the ships leave until the tea was unloaded and the tax paid. This created a standoff. On the evening of December 16th, 1773, approximately 100 men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the cold water. The tea was worth about £10,000, a fortune at the time. This event, which became known as the Boston Tea Party, was a carefully planned act of protest, not a spontaneous riot. The participants tried to damage nothing but the tea. They even swept the ship's decks clean afterward and replaced a padlock they had broken. But it was still the destruction of a massive amount of private property, and the British government's response would be severe. In spring of 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws the colonists called the Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for, revoked Massachusetts' charter and reduced self-government, allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than in the colonies, and required colonists to house British soldiers in their homes if necessary. To make matters worse from the colonial perspective, Parliament also passed the Quebec Act, which extended the boundaries of Quebec south to the Ohio River and guaranteed French-speaking Catholics in Quebec their traditional rights. This was actually an enlightened and tolerant piece of legislation, but many colonists saw it as threatening. It cut off their claims to Western lands, and anti-Catholic prejudice was still strong in the predominantly Protestant colonies. These acts transformed a local Boston crisis into a continental crisis. Colonists throughout America saw what had happened to Massachusetts and worried they might be next. If Parliament could revoke one colony's charter, it could revoke them all. If it could close Boston's port, it could close any port. The Coercive Acts seemed to prove that Parliament had no respect for colonial rights. In response, 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to a Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September of 1774. Only Georgia, the youngest and most loyal colony, declined to participate. 56 delegates from the other colonies gathered at Carpenter's Hall to discuss their response to British actions. This first Continental Congress represented a remarkable cross-section of colonial leadership. From Massachusetts came Samuel Adams and John Adams. Virginia sent George Washington and Patrick Henry. South Carolina sent Christopher Gadsden and John Rutledge. These men represented different colonies, different economic interests, different social classes, and different views on how to respond to Britain. Some delegates, like Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, hoped for reconciliation and proposed a plan that would create an American Parliament to work alongside the British Parliament. Others, like Samuel Adams, were already thinking about independence, though few dared say it openly yet. Most delegates fell somewhere in between, hoping to restore the old relationship but prepared to defend colonial rights. After much debate, the Congress adopted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, asserting colonial rights and listing complaints against Britain. They also approved the Continental Association, which organised comprehensive boycotts of British goods and created enforcement committees in every town and county. Finally, they agreed to meet again in May of 1775 if their grievances were not addressed. When the delegates returned home, they found their communities organising for possible conflict. Militias drilled on town commons, blacksmiths forged weapons, housewives gathered supplies. In Massachusetts, special companies of militia called minutemen prepared to respond at a moment's notice to any British military action. Throughout the winter of 1774 to 1775, tension built. British troops in Boston found themselves increasingly isolated in a hostile city. General Thomas Gage, the military governor, worried about the weapons and supplies he knew the colonists were accumulating in nearby towns. Part 2. The Revolution begins. In the early morning darkness of April 19th, 1775, approximately 700 British soldiers left Boston and marched toward the town of Concord, about 20 miles northwest. Their mission was to seize military supplies the colonists had stored there and possibly to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying in nearby Lexington. But the British march was no secret. The colonists had organised an intelligence network that included watchers in Boston who would signal when British troops moved. When the soldiers left Boston, riders galloped into the countryside to spread the alarm. The most famous of these riders was Paul Revere, a Boston silversmith, though he was not alone. William Dawes took a different route, and Samuel Prescott eventually completed the warning to Concord after Revere was captured by a British patrol. By the time the British reached Lexington at dawn, about 70 militia had gathered on the town common. Their captain, John Parker, had reportedly told them, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The British commander ordered the militia to disperse. The Americans began to leave, though not quickly enough for the British soldiers, who were tired, nervous, and angry about being met with armed resistance. Someone fired a shot. To this day, no one knows which side fired first, or whether it was a deliberate shot or an accidental discharge. But that shot, famously called "the shot heard round the world" by poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, triggered a volley from the British soldiers. When the smoke cleared, 8 militiamen lay dead and 10 were wounded. The British had suffered only 1 wounded soldier. The British troops reformed and marched on to Concord, where they found and destroyed what few military supplies the colonists had not managed to hide. But by now, militia were gathering from all the surrounding towns. At Concord's North Bridge, British soldiers attempting to prevent militia from crossing opened fire, and this time the militia fired back in organised volleys. The British were forced to retreat. The march back to Boston became a nightmare for the British soldiers. Hundreds of militiamen lined the road, firing from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. The British soldiers, trained for European-style warfare with massed formations, found themselves helpless against these hit-and-run tactics. They ran out of ammunition and would have been destroyed if reinforcements from Boston had not met them in Lexington with fresh supplies and cover. By the time the exhausted British soldiers stumbled back into Boston that evening, they had suffered 273 casualties, 73 dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. The militia had lost 93 men, 49 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. These casualty figures shocked both sides. What had begun as a show of force had turned into open warfare. News of Lexington and Concord spread rapidly through the colonies. Militia from throughout New England converged on Boston, putting the city under siege. The British were trapped, controlling only the city itself, while thousands of armed colonists surrounded them. The revolution had begun, though even now, most colonists would have said they were fighting to defend their rights as British subjects, not to create an independent nation. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on May 10th, 1775, just 3 weeks after Lexington and Concord. The situation had changed dramatically since their last meeting. They now had to decide how to respond to what was effectively a state of war, even though no one had officially declared war. The Congress's first major military decision was to adopt the New England Army besieging Boston as a Continental Army and to appoint a commander-in-chief. John Adams of Massachusetts made a crucial political decision when he nominated George Washington of Virginia for this position. Adams knew that making a Virginian the commander would help transform what might be seen as a New England rebellion into a continental cause. Washington was wealthy, experienced, dignified, and most importantly, he was from the South. Washington accepted the appointment with characteristic modesty, saying he did not think himself equal to the command but would do his best. On July 3rd, 1775, he took command of the army at Cambridge, Massachusetts. What he found was less an army than an armed mob. Approximately 14,000 men had gathered, but they lacked organization, training, uniforms, adequate weapons, and supplies. Many of the men had elected their own officers and felt free to come and go as they pleased. Transforming this collection of farmers and tradesmen into an effective fighting force would become Washington's great challenge. Meanwhile, on June 17th, 1775, before Washington arrived, a major battle occurred on the hills overlooking Boston Harbor. The colonists had fortified Breed's Hill next to Bunker Hill with earthworks during the night. When the British discovered this in the morning, they decided they had to dislodge the Americans. In the early afternoon, approximately 2,200 British soldiers, dressed in their heavy wool uniforms on a hot summer day, marched up the hill in neat ranks. They expected the American militia to break and run, as they had in other small encounters. But the Americans, supposedly led by Colonel William Prescott, who famously ordered, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," held their fire until the British were very close, then unleashed devastating volleys. The British fell back, reformed, and attacked again. Again the Americans drove them back. On the third attack, the Americans ran out of ammunition and were finally forced to retreat. The British took the hill, but at a terrible cost. they suffered over 1,000 casualties, including more than 200 killed. Many of the dead were officers who had been specifically targeted by American marksmen. The Americans lost about 450 men, including General Joseph Warren, a prominent Boston physician and Patriot leader. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as it was incorrectly named after the nearby but unfortified Bunker Hill, proved that American militia could stand and fight against British regulars. The battle's casualty ratio shocked Britain and encouraged the Americans. It also made the British more cautious, having learned that taking fortified positions held by determined Americans was costly. While fighting raged around Boston, the Continental Congress struggled with the question of their ultimate goal. Were they fighting to restore their rights within the British Empire, or were they fighting for something more? Most delegates still hoped for reconciliation. In July of 1775, they approved the Olive Branch Petition, a last appeal to King George III, asking him to intervene with Parliament to protect colonial rights. The king refused to receive the petition. Instead, in August, he issued a proclamation of rebellion, declaring that the colonies were in open rebellion and ordering his officers to suppress the insurrection. This pushed more colonists toward the idea that reconciliation was impossible. The year 1775 also saw American attempts to bring Canada into the rebellion. Two expeditions set out, one led by General Richard Montgomery moving north from New York along Lake Champlain, and another led by Benedict Arnold pushing through the Maine wilderness. Montgomery captured Montreal in November, but the combined attack on Quebec City on December 31st, 1775, failed disastrously. Montgomery was killed, Arnold was wounded, and the American troops were forced to maintain a futile siege through the brutal winter before withdrawing in spring. Back in Boston, Washington worked through the fall and winter to organize and supply his army. He faced constant problems. Many soldiers' enlistments expired at the end of 1775, and he had to recruit a new army while maintaining the siege. Gunpowder was in critically short supply. Washington was so desperate that he wrote letters in code about gunpowder, referring to it by other names, fearing British spies would intercept his correspondence. The stalemate finally broke in March of 1776 when Washington placed captured artillery, hauled all the way from Fort Ticonderoga in New York by Henry Knox and his men during the winter, on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston. The British, under their new commander General William Howe, recognized their position was now untenable. On March 17th, 1776, the British evacuated Boston by ship, taking about 1,000 Loyalist civilians with them. They sailed first to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to regroup. The British evacuation of Boston was a major victory for Washington and the Continental Army, but everyone knew the British would return with a larger force. The question was where they would strike next, and how the colonies would be prepared to resist. During this time, sentiment for independence was growing, fueled partly by a short pamphlet published in January of 1776. Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, an English immigrant who had arrived in America only in 1774, made a powerful case for independence in plain language ordinary people could understand. Paine attacked the very idea of monarchy, calling it an absurd form of government. He argued that America had nothing to gain from remaining connected to Britain and everything to gain from independence. The pamphlet sold an estimated 500,000 copies in a population of 2.5 million, making it a colonial bestseller. It was read aloud in taverns, homes, and army camps. Common sense transformed the debate, making independence seem not just possible, but necessary and right. As spring turned to summer in 1776, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia slowly moved toward the momentous decision. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The Congress debated the resolution while appointing a committee to draft a formal declaration in case it passed. The committee consisted of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Jefferson, a 33-year-old Virginia planter and lawyer known for his writing ability, was assigned to draft the actual document. He worked for about 2 weeks, consulting with the other committee members, particularly Adams and Franklin, who suggested some changes. Jefferson's declaration was a masterpiece of political philosophy and practical politics. It began with a preamble explaining why the colonies felt compelled to separate from Britain. Then came the most famous words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." These words expressed Enlightenment ideals about natural rights and human equality that would echo through history. The Declaration then listed specific grievances against King George III, carefully laying out the case for independence by documenting how the king had violated the colonists' rights. Finally, it concluded with the actual declaration that the colonies were free and independent states. The Continental Congress debated Jefferson's draft, making various changes. Most notably, they removed a long passage condemning slavery and the slave trade. This passage had blamed the king for imposing slavery on the colonies, which was historically inaccurate and hypocritical given that many of the founding fathers, including Jefferson himself, owned enslaved people. Delegates from South Carolina and Georgia refused to accept it, and northern delegates involved in the slave trade also objected. The removal of this passage was a compromise that revealed the fundamental contradiction in a declaration proclaiming that all men are created equal while slavery remained legal. On July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress voted to approve Lee's resolution of independence. The vote was 12-0, with New York abstaining because they lacked instructions from their colonial assembly. 2 days later, on July 4th, the Congress approved the edited Declaration of Independence. This date, the 4th of July, would become Independence Day, though the vote for independence actually happened on the 2nd. The declaration was first publicly read on July 8th in Philadelphia, where it was greeted with celebrations. Copies were distributed throughout the colonies to be read aloud in town squares and churches. The reaction was mixed. Patriots celebrated with bonfires, parades, and the pulling down of statues of King George. Loyalists who remained faithful to Britain worried about what would come next. Many ordinary colonists probably had mixed feelings, uncertain whether independence was wise or achievable, but committed to supporting their community's decisions. It's worth noting that independence was not universally popular. Perhaps 1/3 of colonists remained loyal to Britain. Another third actively supported independence. The final third were probably neutral or shifted their allegiance depending on circumstances. families were divided. Benjamin Franklin's son William remained loyal to Britain. The revolution would, in many ways, be a civil war as well as a war for independence. Part 3. The struggle for independence. Having declared independence, the Americans now had to win it on the battlefield. This would prove far more difficult than anyone imagined in the heady summer of 1776. The British strategy was to use their overwhelming military and naval superiority to crush the rebellion quickly. They had the world's most powerful navy, a professional army, the wealth to hire thousands of German mercenaries, and a population and industrial capacity far exceeding America's. The British planned to capture major cities, control the coast with their navy, and isolate New England from the other colonies by controlling the Hudson River Valley. In summer of 1776, the British launched their main offensive against New York City. General William Howe commanded an army of approximately 32,000 men, including 9,000 German soldiers, mostly from the state of Hesse-Kassel, whom the Americans called Hessians. This was the largest expeditional force Britain had ever sent overseas. Washington, with only about 19,000 soldiers, many inexperienced and poorly equipped, tried to defend New York. This was probably a mistake. The city, surrounded by water, was nearly impossible to defend against the British Navy, but Washington felt politically compelled to make a stand. The Battle of Long Island on August 27, 1776, was a disaster for the Americans. The British outflanked Washington's positions, and only nightfall and fog allowed the American army to escape across the East River to Manhattan. Washington conducted a brilliant nighttime evacuation, moving about 9,000 men across the river in small boats while the British were unaware. But the situation in New York continued to deteriorate. The British landed on Manhattan, and Washington was forced to abandon the city in September. The Americans retreated north through Manhattan, fighting delaying actions. At Harlem Heights on September 16th, they scored a small victory that boosted morale. But at White Plains on October 28th, the British again defeated Washington and forced him to continue retreating. In mid-November, the British captured Fort Washington on the northern tip of Manhattan Island, taking nearly 3,000 American prisoners. Days later, Fort Lee, across the river in New Jersey, also fell. Washington was left with only about 3,000 men, and their enlistments were expiring. The Continental Army seemed to be disintegrating. Washington retreated across New Jersey with the British in pursuit. He crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania on December 7th, taking all boats with him so the British couldn't follow. Thomas Paine, who had joined the army as a volunteer, wrote during this bleak retreat, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." The situation was desperate. The army was melting away as enlistments expired. Congress fled Philadelphia, fearing British capture. Many people began to think the revolution was over. Some even began taking loyalty oaths to the British to protect their property. But Washington was planning one last desperate gamble. On Christmas night, 1776, in a driving snowstorm, he led about 2,400 men across the ice-choked Delaware River. They marched 9 miles through the freezing night to Trenton, where about 1,500 Hessian soldiers were garrisoning the town. The attack on the morning of December 26th caught the Hessians completely by surprise. Many had been celebrating Christmas and were dealing with hangovers. The Americans overwhelmed the town in less than 2 hours of fighting. They captured nearly 1,000 prisoners, while losing only 2 men to freezing rather than combat. Washington ferried his prisoners and captured supplies back across the Delaware. The victory was more psychological than strategic, but it was exactly what the revolution needed. It proved the Continental Army could win. It boosted recruitment. It gave Congress and civilians hope. A week later, Washington crossed the Delaware again and won another victory at Princeton on January 3rd, 1777, before taking his army into winter quarters at Morristown, New Jersey. The campaigns of 1776 revealed patterns that would characterize much of the war. The British could win battles and capture cities, but they couldn't control the countryside. When they advanced, the Continental Army retreated. When they withdrew, the Americans came back. The British found themselves holding a few points in a hostile land, while Washington's army, though often defeated, somehow survived. The year 1777 brought a major turning point in the war. The British devised a strategy to cut off New England from the other colonies by controlling the Hudson River Valley and Lake Champlain. 3 armies would converge on Albany, New York. General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada. Colonel Barry St. Leger would march east from Lake Ontario, and General Howe would march north from New York City. But the plan fell apart in execution. Howe decided instead to capture Philadelphia, the American capital. He sailed his army to the head of Chesapeake Bay and marched on Philadelphia from the south. Washington tried to stop him at Brandywine Creek on September 11th, but was defeated. The British occupied Philadelphia on September 26th. Washington attempted to dislodge the British from Germantown, just outside Philadelphia, on October 4th. But the attack, which depended on coordinated movements in fog, became confused and failed. The Continental Army retreated to Valley Forge for the winter, while Congress fled to York, Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, in upstate New York, Burgoyne's campaign was collapsing. His army of about 7,000 British regulars, German mercenaries, Canadian militia, and Native American allies moved slowly south from Canada, slowed by difficult terrain and the need to build roads through wilderness. American militia felled trees across paths, drove away livestock, and destroyed crops, making Burgoyne's advance increasingly difficult. St. Leger's force, advancing from the west, was stopped at Fort Stanwix. When Benedict Arnold approached with reinforcements, spreading rumours that he had a much larger force than he actually did, St. Leger's Native American allies abandoned him, and he was forced to retreat. Burgoyne, isolated and running low on supplies, continued toward Albany. On August 16th, he sent about 800 men to raid Bennington, Vermont for supplies. They ran into over 2,000 American militia, led by General John Stark, who reportedly told his men, "There are the redcoats, and they are ours," or "This night Molly Stark sleeps a widow." The militia destroyed the British force, killing or capturing almost all of them. Burgoyne's situation became increasingly desperate. American forces, including Continental troops under General Horatio Gates and militia from throughout New England and New York, surrounded him near Saratoga. 2 battles, on September 19th and October 7th, went badly for the British. The second battle, was influenced by the reckless bravery of Benedict Arnold, who charged into combat despite having been relieved of command by Gates after a dispute. On October 17th, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men. This was the greatest American victory of the war and changed everything. The victory proved the Americans could defeat a major British army. More importantly, it convinced France that the Americans might actually win. France had been secretly sending supplies to the Americans since early in the war, but now French leaders saw an opportunity to weaken their old enemy Britain. In February of 1778, France signed treaties of alliance and commerce with the United States. This brought French naval power, military forces, and financial support to the American side, and effectively transformed the conflict into a global war between Britain and France. But while Gates celebrated victory at Saratoga, Washington's army suffered through a terrible winter at Valley Forge. From December of 1777 to June of 1778, the army camped about 20 miles from Philadelphia. Conditions were brutal. The soldiers lacked adequate food, clothing, and shelter. Many lived in crude log huts, sleeping on straw or bare ground. Diseases like typhus, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia swept through the camp. Of the approximately 12,000 men who wintered at Valley Forge, about 2,000 died. The suffering was partly due to British control of Philadelphia and the productive farmland around it, but it also reflected problems with the Continental Congress's inability to supply the army. Congress lacked the power to tax and had to rely on requests to the states and increasingly worthless paper money called Continentals. Many farmers preferred to sell food to the British for gold rather than to the Continental Army for paper money. Yet Valley Forge was also a turning point. A Prussian military officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived at camp in February and began drilling the troops. Von Steuben, with a somewhat exaggerated military background but real skill as a trainer, created a simplified drill manual adapted to American conditions and spent the rest of the winter training the army. He taught the men to march in formation, execute coordinated movements, load and fire efficiently, and use bayonets. By the time the army left Valley Forge in June, it was far more professional and capable than when it arrived. The entry of France into the war changed British strategy. They now had to worry about defending their valuable Caribbean sugar islands and dealing with threats to British territories worldwide. In June of 1778, the British evacuated Philadelphia and consolidated their forces in New York. Washington's army, leaving Valley Forge, pursued them across New Jersey. At Monmouth Courthouse on June 28th, in blazing heat, the two armies fought to a draw in the longest sustained battle of the war. Washington's reformed army performed well, proving that von Steuben's training had been effective. The war now shifted to the southern colonies. The British believed the South had more loyalists who would support them. They also hoped to encourage enslaved people to desert their owners and disrupt the southern economy. In December of 1778, the British easily captured Savannah, Georgia. In May of 1780, they captured Charleston, South Carolina, along with about 5,000 Continental soldiers in the worst American defeat of the war. The British seemed to be winning the South. They established a chain of posts across South Carolina and Georgia, but they found, as they had in the North, that controlling territory was difficult. American partisans, led by men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens launched guerrilla attacks on British supply lines and isolated posts. The fighting in the south was particularly brutal. Unlike the north, where armies generally followed European conventions, the southern campaigns often resembled a civil war. Patriot and loyalist militias massacred prisoners, burned homes, and terrorized civilians. The war in the south tore communities apart as neighbors who had lived together for years now killed each other. In August of 1780, Continental forces under General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, tried to retake the South, but were crushingly defeated at Camden, South Carolina. Gates's reputation was destroyed when he reportedly fled the battlefield on the fastest horse he could find. Washington sent General Nathanael Greene, one of his most trusted commanders, to take over the Southern Army in December of 1780. Greene, a Rhode Island Quaker who had been expelled from his faith for joining the military, was a brilliant strategist. Rather than fight large conventional battles he knew he would lose, Greene divided his forces and manoeuvred constantly, forcing the British to chase him across the Carolinas. At Cowpens, South Carolina, on January 17, 1781, Continental and militia forces under General Daniel Morgan won a stunning victory using brilliant tactics. Morgan arranged his militia in front where the British expected them to break and run, but he told them to fire just 2 volleys and then retreat through the Continental soldiers behind them. The British, thinking the Americans were fleeing, charged into the waiting Continental regulars and were destroyed. Over 80% of the British force was killed or captured. The British commander in the south, Lord Cornwallis, pursued Greene across North Carolina, trying to force a decisive battle. At Guilford Courthouse on March 15, 1781, the British technically won, driving Greene from the field, but British casualties were so heavy that one British politician remarked, "Another such victory would ruin the British army." Cornwallis, his army weakened and far from supply bases, made a fateful decision to march into Virginia, where he believed he could find supplies and loyalist support. He occupied the port of Yorktown on the Virginia coast to establish contact with the British Navy. This decision would lead to the climactic campaign of the war. Washington had spent most of 1779, 1780, and 1781 around New York, engaged in inconclusive manoeuvring with the main British army. When he learned that Cornwallis was at Yorktown and that a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing north from the Caribbean, he saw an opportunity. If the French fleet could temporarily control Chesapeake Bay and prevent the British Navy from reaching Cornwallis, the British army at Yorktown could be trapped. In one of the best-kept secrets of the war, Washington marched most of his army south from New York, making the British think he was heading for their positions. By the time the British realized the American and French armies were heading for Virginia, it was too late. The French fleet arrived in Chesapeake Bay at the end of August and defeated a British fleet on September 5, 1781, in what's called the Battle of the Chesapeake. The French fleet then blocked the bay, trapping Cornwallis. By late September, approximately 17,000 American and French troops, with heavy siege artillery, surrounded Cornwallis's force of about 8,000 men at Yorktown. The Allies began a formal siege, digging approach trenches and moving their artillery closer to the British fortifications. British positions came under intense bombardment from over 100 Allied cannon. On October 14th, American and French troops stormed 2 key British redoubts. The Americans, led by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, and the French each captured their objectives in swift nighttime assaults. These successes allowed the Allies to bring their artillery even closer to the British lines. Cornwallis attempted a desperate nighttime escape across the York River on October 16th, but a storm scattered his boats. With no hope of relief or escape, and his position becoming increasingly untenable, Cornwallis asked for terms on October 17th. The surrender ceremony took place on October 19th, 1781. The British soldiers marched out between two lines of American and French troops to surrender their arms. British military bands reportedly played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," which was appropriate as the surrender of a major British army to the American upstarts did indeed turn the world upside down. Cornwallis, claiming illness, did not attend the ceremony, sending his second-in-command instead. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended major fighting in the Revolutionary War, though it would take 2 more years to negotiate a formal peace treaty. When news of Yorktown reached London in late November, the British Prime Minister, Lord North, reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." The British still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah, but they had no will to continue the war. The costs were too high. France and Spain were threatening British territories worldwide, and there was no clear path to victory. Peace negotiations began in Paris in April of 1782. The American negotiators included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. The negotiations were complex because the Americans had to deal not just with Britain, but also with their ally France, whose interests sometimes diverged from American interests. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3rd, 1783. Britain recognized American independence and agreed to generous boundaries for the new nation. The United States would extend from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes to Spanish Florida. In return, the Americans agreed to recommend that states restore property confiscated from loyalists, though few states actually did this. The Revolutionary War had lasted 8 years and cost approximately 25,000 American deaths in combat and from disease. British losses were somewhat lower, around 24,000, but these numbers don't capture the full cost. Thousands of civilians died from disease, exposure, and violence. Tens of thousands of loyalists fled to Canada, Britain, or other parts of the British Empire, leaving behind homes and property. Native American tribes that had allied with Britain faced American retaliation and lost more of their lands. The war left the new nation deeply in debt and facing enormous challenges in creating a functional government. Part 4. Daily life during the Revolution. While armies marched and politicians debated in Philadelphia, ordinary people throughout the colonies lived through years of uncertainty, hardship, and change. Daily life during the American Revolution varied enormously depending on where people lived, their social class, race, gender, and which side they supported. For most Americans, who were farmers, the revolution meant trying to maintain normal agricultural rhythms while dealing with armies, militia call-ups, supply demands, and economic disruption. The agricultural year, unchanged for generations, continued to dictate the rhythm of life. Spring planting, summer cultivation, fall harvest, and winter preparation still had to be done, regardless of political upheaval. Farmers rose at dawn, as they always had, Men and boys worked in the fields with simple tools: wooden ploughs pulled by oxen or horses, hoes, scythes for cutting grain, and sickles for harvesting. Women and girls worked equally hard, managing household production that was essential for family survival. They cooked over open fires, preserved food, made soap and candles, spun thread, wove cloth, and sewed clothing. They also worked in gardens, tended chickens and dairy cows, and helped with harvests. The work was back-breaking and constant. A woman might spend hours every day just getting meals ready, drawing water from a well, maintaining a fire, cooking porridge or stew in iron pots, baking bread in a brick oven or over the fire. Laundry was an all-day task, done less frequently than modern people might imagine, involving hauling water, heating it, scrubbing clothes by hand, and hanging them to dry. Children were expected to contribute from a young age. By 5 or 6, children could feed chickens, gather eggs, watch younger siblings, or help with spinning. By their early teens, children could do most adult tasks. Formal education was limited and inconsistent. In New England, town schools provided basic literacy, but attendance was irregular, especially during planting and harvest. In the South, education was even more limited, available mainly to wealthy families who could hire tutors. The Revolution disrupted these patterns in many ways. Militia service pulled men away from farms at crucial times. One Massachusetts man wrote in his diary that he had to leave for militia duty just as his grain was ready to harvest. When he returned weeks later, much of the crop was ruined. The army's constant need for supplies meant requisitions of food, horses, wagons, and blankets. Congress paid with increasingly worthless continental currency. Some farmers were paid with certificates promising payment after the war, which many ended up selling at deep discounts. Areas where armies operated faced special hardships. Both armies foraged for supplies, which was a polite word for taking food and other goods from civilians. Soldiers camped in fields, knocked down fences for firewood, and let their horses eat growing crops. Armies also brought disease. When troops camped near towns, diseases like smallpox, typhus, and dysentery often spread to civilian populations. Women's roles expanded during the war. With men away in the army or militia, women had to manage farms and businesses. This was not entirely new. Colonial women had always had important economic roles. But the war intensified these responsibilities. Women ploughed fields, managed harvests, and made business decisions that would normally have been made by men. Some women discovered they were quite capable of handling these tasks, which may have subtly changed some people's views of women's abilities. Women also contributed directly to the war effort. The boycotts of British goods depended heavily on women's participation. Women organised spinning bees, where they gathered to spin thread and weave cloth, making it socially respectable to wear homespun clothing rather than British imports. Some women refused to serve tea or used herbal substitutes. These actions politicized traditionally female activities. When armies were nearby, women sometimes served as cooks, laundresses, and nurses for the soldiers. The Continental Army officially allowed a certain number of women to accompany each regiment, usually wives of soldiers. These women were not just camp followers. They performed essential services that the army could not function without. They washed uniforms, cooked, nursed the sick and wounded, and sometimes even loaded muskets or cannon during battles. A few women, like Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, known as Molly Pitcher, apparently took over firing cannon when their husbands were wounded. Some women engaged in more unusual activities. A few actually served as soldiers, disguising themselves as men. Deborah Sampson of Massachusetts served for over a year before her sex was discovered when she was wounded. Women also served as spies and messengers, taking advantage of the fact that British soldiers often paid less attention to women. For children, the war was both frightening and sometimes exciting. Children watched soldiers march past, heard cannons in the distance, and listened to adults discussing battles and politics. Some encountered enemy soldiers or saw the aftermath of battles. Joseph Plum Martin, who joined the Continental Army at 15, later wrote vivid memoirs of his experiences. The war also created opportunities for some children, particularly boys, to participate in ways they normally wouldn't. Boys served as drummers and fifers in armies, carrying messages and helping with various camp tasks. Some teenagers joined the army or militia despite being underage. The minimum enlistment age was supposed to be 16, but it was not strictly enforced. For enslaved African Americans, the war created both opportunities and dangers. When the war began, about 500,000 enslaved people lived in the colonies, mostly in the South. The ideals of the revolution, with its talk of liberty and equality, created an obvious contradiction with slavery. Some enslaved people tried to use this to gain freedom. In Massachusetts, enslaved people petitioned the legislature for freedom, pointing to the inconsistency between fighting for liberty while denying it to others. The British offered freedom to enslaved people who joined their side. In November of 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved people belonging to rebels if they joined British forces. This terrified Southern slaveholders, but attracted hundreds and eventually thousands of black people to British lines. Many joined Ethiopian regiments or similar units and fought for the British. The Americans also enlisted some black soldiers, though more reluctantly and with many restrictions. In the North, some states allowed free black men to serve in the Continental Army, and a few enslaved men were promised freedom in exchange for service. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment enlisted enslaved men with their master's consent, promising them freedom after the war. This unit fought bravely in several engagements. Overall, about 5,000 black men served in the Continental Army or state militias. For enslaved people in areas controlled by the Americans, the war often meant increased hardship. With white men away fighting, enslaved people faced increased workloads and sometimes harsher treatment from overseers. When armies passed through, enslaved people faced dangers from soldiers on both sides. Some tried to escape to British lines but were caught. Others succeeded in reaching freedom but then faced uncertain futures in British-controlled areas. When the war ended, the fate of black loyalists became a major issue. About 20,000 black people left with the British when they evacuated. Some went to Nova Scotia, where they faced discrimination and hardship despite British promises. Others went to Britain itself, or eventually to Sierra Leone in Africa. Those who had supported the American side and been promised freedom sometimes found that the promises were not kept. The northern states gradually abolished slavery after the war, but the southern states did not, and the new constitution implicitly protected slavery. Native Americans faced devastating consequences from the revolution. Most tribes tried to remain neutral, recognizing that regardless of who won, European expansion into their territories would likely continue. But neutrality proved impossible. Both sides sought Indian allies, or at least their neutrality, and punished tribes seen as supporting the enemy. The Iroquois Confederacy, a powerful alliance of 6 nations in New York and the surrounding region, split over the war. Most Iroquois, particularly the Mohawk led by Joseph Brant, sided with the British, who seemed less likely to take their lands than the land-hungry Americans. The Oneida and Tuscarora mostly supported the Americans. This split led to tragic consequences. The Iroquois Confederacy, which had maintained peace among its member nations for centuries, was torn apart by civil war as Iroquois fought Iroquois. In 1778 and 1779, American forces launched devastating raids into Iroquois territory, burning towns and crops in retaliation for Indian raids on American settlements. General John Sullivan led a major expedition in 1779 that destroyed dozens of Iroquois towns in New York, leaving thousands of Native Americans homeless and starving. In the South, the Cherokee initially tried to remain neutral, but eventually attacked American settlements in 1776, partly in response to continued American encroachment on their lands. American militia retaliated by burning Cherokee towns. Throughout the war, frontier fighting between Native Americans and American settlers was brutal, with atrocities committed by both sides. When the war ended, Native Americans found they had lost, regardless of which side they supported. The Treaty of Paris transferred all British territory south of the Great Lakes to the United States without any mention of Native American rights to these lands. Tribes that had allied with Britain received no protection in the peace treaty. American settlers poured west across the Appalachians into territory that tribes still considered their own, setting up conflicts that would continue for decades. Loyalists, Americans who remained faithful to Britain, faced persecution that increased as the war went on. In the war's early years, loyalism was tolerated in many areas. But as fighting intensified and positions hardened, communities turned against those seen as loyal to the king. Loyalists faced social ostracism, economic boycotts, property confiscation, imprisonment, and violence. Some were tarred and feathered, a painful and humiliating punishment that sometimes proved fatal. Loyalist families were forced to flee their homes, often losing everything. The exact number of loyalists is hard to determine, but historians estimate they comprised 20 to 30% of the white population. They came from all social classes and regions, though they were more numerous in areas with strong ties to Britain, such as port cities and regions settled by recent immigrants. Many office holders, Anglican clergy, and wealthy merchants remained loyal, but so did many ordinary farmers and tradesmen. Some loyalists formed military units and fought for Britain. The Queen's Rangers, the King's American Regiment, and similar units included thousands of loyalist soldiers. These Americans in British service fought in major campaigns and also conducted raids on patriot communities. The bitterness between patriots and loyalists sometimes exceeded that between Americans and British regulars. When Britain lost the war, about 60,000 loyalists left America. Many went to Canada, particularly to Nova Scotia and what would become Ontario, where the British government provided land and supplies. Others went to Britain itself, the Caribbean, or even Florida when it was returned to Spain. Those who left were often the most committed loyalists. Many others who had loyalist sympathies simply kept quiet and adjusted to the new reality. Life in cities during the Revolution varied depending on which side controlled them. In occupied cities like New York and Philadelphia, when the British held them, or Charleston after its capture, loyalists lived relatively normally, attending social events, theatres, and markets. But patriot civilians in occupied cities faced restrictions, surveillance, and sometimes imprisonment. The British Army's presence meant shortages of housing and goods as military needs took priority. In Patriot-controlled cities like Boston after the British evacuation, or Philadelphia after they left, life was disrupted by military preparations, economic dislocations, and the presence of armies passing through. Cities served as administrative centres for the war effort, with committees organising supplies, recruiting soldiers, and enforcing loyalty. Prisons held loyalists and British prisoners of war under often terrible conditions. Economic life was severely disrupted throughout the colonies. British blockades made overseas trade difficult and expensive. Ships that did get through might be captured by British warships or privateers. The disruption of normal trade patterns caused shortages of manufactured goods that the colonies had previously imported from Britain: cloth, metal tools, gunpowder, and countless other items. The Continental Congress and state governments tried to pay for the war by printing paper money. This led to severe inflation. By 1780, continental currency was virtually worthless, giving rise to the phrase, "not worth a continental." Soldiers were sometimes paid in worthless paper money, and civilians who accepted it in payment for goods lost heavily. Merchants who insisted on payment in gold or silver coins were often denounced as greedy, but they were simply trying to protect themselves from inflation. The economic disruption and inflation affected different people differently. Merchants who could import scarce goods and sell them at high prices sometimes did well. Farmers who could sell food to armies received steady income, though often in depreciated currency. People on fixed incomes, like widows living on pensions or workers whose wages didn't keep pace with inflation, suffered greatly. Religious life continued during the war, though it was affected in various ways. Most churches supported the patriot cause, or at least did not oppose it. Congregationalist ministers in New England, Presbyterian ministers in the Middle Colonies, and some Baptist ministers preached that the revolution was justified and even a religious duty. They drew on biblical examples and Protestant traditions of resistance to tyranny. However, Anglican clergymen who were part of the Church of England and had sworn loyalty to the king faced a dilemma. Some supported independence despite their oaths, but many remained loyal to Britain and faced persecution as a result. After the war, the Anglican Church in America reorganized as the Episcopal Church, cutting ties with British authority. Quakers, committed to pacifism, tried to remain neutral, but both sides viewed neutrality with suspicion. Quakers who refused to support the war effort faced fines, property confiscation, and imprisonment. Some Quakers were expelled from their faith for supporting the revolution or serving in the military, as happened to Nathaniel Greene. Despite the disruptions, religious services continued. People still baptized children, married, and buried their dead with religious ceremonies. Churches provided not just spiritual support, but also social centers where communities gathered. During hard times, churches helped organize relief for the poor, widows, and orphans. The war years also saw cultural changes. Before the revolution, many colonists had proudly considered themselves British. They followed British fashions, read British books, and maintained British customs. The Revolution required Americans to create a new identity. They began to see themselves as Americans rather than British, though what exactly that meant was unclear. This emerging American identity was expressed in various ways. Patriots wore clothing made from homespun cloth to show their independence from British imports. They drank herbal teas instead of British tea. They wrote plays, poems, and essays celebrating American virtues and condemning British tyranny. The Declaration of Independence itself was a powerful expression of American ideals distinct from British traditions. Yet Americans also remained tied to British culture in many ways. Most Americans still spoke English, followed British legal traditions, and read British books. Creating a distinctly American culture would be a long process that continued well after the war ended. Education during the war years was disrupted but continued. In New England, town schools remained open when possible, though teachers were sometimes called away for militia service. Wealthy families continued to hire tutors for their children. Many children received their primary education at home from parents or in small dame schools run by women in their homes. For those who could afford it, higher education was available at a handful of colleges. Harvard, Yale, the College of New Jersey, later Princeton, King's College, later Columbia, the College of Philadelphia, later the University of Pennsylvania, and the College of William and Mary all continued operating during the war years, though with reduced enrollments and frequent disruptions. Some colleges saw their buildings commandeered for military use as hospitals or barracks. The content of education also began to reflect Republican values. Textbooks and lessons increasingly emphasized virtues thought essential for citizens of a republic: honesty, industry, frugality, and civic duty. The Revolution created a new emphasis on education as essential preparation for citizenship in a self-governing nation. Medical care during the Revolution was primitive by modern standards. Doctors had limited understanding of disease causation and treatment. The main medical theory was that diseases resulted from imbalances in bodily humours, leading to treatments like bloodletting, purging, and inducing vomiting. These treatments probably did more harm than good. Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases. It killed about 30% of those infected and left survivors badly scarred. Washington made the controversial decision to inoculate the Continental Army against smallpox. Inoculation involved deliberately infecting people with a mild form of the disease, which usually provided immunity. The procedure was risky and sometimes fatal, but it greatly reduced smallpox deaths in the army. Other common diseases included typhus, typhoid fever, dysentery, and malaria. Army camps with poor sanitation and crowded conditions were breeding grounds for disease. Far more soldiers died from disease than from combat wounds. Hospitals were places to be avoided if possible, as they had high mortality rates. For wounded soldiers and civilians, treatment was often agonizing. There were no anesthetics except alcohol. Surgeons operated quickly, amputating shattered limbs in minutes. Those who survived surgery faced the risk of infection, against which doctors had no effective treatment. Clean bandages and washing wounds with clean water were about all doctors could do, though these simple measures probably saved lives. Women often served as nurses, both in military hospitals and caring for sick or wounded family members at home. Though nursing was not yet a formal profession, women's nursing care was probably more beneficial than much of what doctors did. Throughout all these hardships, people found ways to maintain morale and moments of normalcy. Soldiers in winter camps organized theatricals, horse races, and other entertainments. Civilians held husking bees, quilting parties, and barn raisings that combined work with socializing. Young people still courted and married, children still played. People celebrated Christmas, Easter, and other holidays as best they could under the circumstances. Letters between family members separated by the war provide poignant glimpses into daily life. Soldiers wrote home describing their experiences, asking about family news, and expressing longing to return. Wives wrote to husbands about managing farms, raising children, and dealing with hardships. These letters revealed both the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people and the very human costs of the war. Part 5. The Impact and Legacy of the American Revolution. The American Revolution's impact extended far beyond the battlefield victories that secured American independence. It fundamentally changed political ideas, social structures, and international relations in ways that continue to resonate today. Most immediately, the revolution created the United States of America, a new nation based on the revolutionary principle that governments derive their legitimate authority from the consent of the governed. This was a radical idea in a world where most people lived under monarchies that claimed to rule by divine right. The Declaration of Independence's assertion that all men are created equal and possess inalienable rights challenged the hierarchical assumptions that had governed human societies for millennia. But creating a nation was easier than creating a functional government. The Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1777 but not ratified by all states until 1781, created a weak central government with most power remaining in the states. This reflected Americans' fear of centralized authority after their experience with British rule. But it created serious problems. The national government could not effectively tax, regulate interstate commerce, or enforce its laws. It could only request that states contribute money and comply with its decisions, requests that states often ignored. The weakness of the Articles became increasingly apparent during the 1780s. The government struggled to pay debts incurred during the war. It could not effectively respond to trade disputes with Britain and Spain. Individual states issued their own currencies, erected trade barriers against each other, and pursued independent foreign policies. By the mid-1780s, many leaders worried that the new nation might collapse into separate confederacies or return to monarchy. These concerns led to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in summer of 1787. Delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island refused to participate, met to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they created an entirely new framework of government. The resulting constitution, approved in September 1787 and ratified by the necessary 9 states by June 1788, created a stronger federal government with powers to tax, regulate commerce, and enforce laws. The Constitution represented a series of compromises between different visions and interests. Large states and small states compromised on representation, creating a two-house legislature with representation based on population in one house and equal representation in the other. Northern and southern states compromised on slavery, with the Constitution allowing the slave trade to continue for 20 years and counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. State governments and federal government divided powers, with some powers reserved exclusively to the federal government, some to the states, and some shared. The Constitution also created an innovative system of checks and balances. Power was divided among 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Each branch had ways to check the others, preventing any single branch from becoming too powerful. This system reflected deep distrust of concentrated power while recognizing the need for effective government. Many Americans worried that even this limited federal government was too powerful. They demanded a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution, ratified in 1791, guaranteed freedoms of speech, press, religion, and assembly, the right to bear arms, protections against unreasonable searches and arbitrary imprisonment, the right to trial by jury, and other fundamental rights. The constitutional system created by the Revolution and refined in the 1780s has proven remarkably durable. The Constitution remains in force today, making it one of the oldest written constitutions still in use. While it has been amended and reinterpreted over time, its basic structure remains unchanged. The Revolution also had profound social impacts, though these were uneven and sometimes contradictory. The ideology of republicanism emphasized virtue, equality among citizens, and participation in public affairs. This ideology was potentially quite radical. If people were equal and government depended on their consent, shouldn't all people have political rights? Some Americans drew these conclusions. In the northern states, where slavery was less economically important than in the South, the Revolution helped drive gradual emancipation. Vermont banned slavery in its constitution in 1777. Pennsylvania began gradual emancipation in 1780. Massachusetts courts interpreted the state constitution's declaration that all men are born free and equal as effectively ending slavery there. Other northern states followed with gradual emancipation plans. These typically freed children born to enslaved mothers after a certain date once they reached adulthood, meaning slavery ended slowly over decades rather than immediately. In the South, where the plantation economy depended on enslaved labor, slavery actually became more entrenched after the Revolution. Some Southern leaders, including Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, expressed moral discomfort with slavery and hoped it would eventually disappear. But economic interests and racist beliefs prevented them from taking effective action to end it. The Constitution protected slavery, and the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made slave labor in cotton cultivation enormously profitable, ensuring slavery's continuation. The Revolution's impact on women's rights was similarly mixed. Women had played important roles during the war, managing farms and businesses, supporting the army, and participating in boycotts. This led some women and men to question traditional gender roles. Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband John during the war, asking him to remember the ladies when creating the new government and warning that women would not be bound by laws in which they had no voice. But the Revolution did not lead to women's suffrage or legal equality. Women still could not vote, hold political office, or serve on juries. Married women still could not own property, sign contracts, or keep their own wages. The ideology of Republican motherhood that developed after the Revolution emphasized women's importance in raising virtuous citizens, which was significant but still confined women primarily to domestic roles. However, the Revolution did lead to some improvements in women's education. If women were to raise virtuous Republican citizens, the argument went they needed education. The late 18th and early 19th centuries saw the founding of numerous female academies, providing women with education beyond basic literacy. This created a generation of better educated women who would eventually use their education to advocate for broader rights. The Revolution also affected religious liberty. Many of the original colonies had established churches supported by taxes. The Revolution's emphasis on individual rights and conscience led to disestablishment in most states. Virginia's Statute for Religious Freedom, drafted by Thomas Jefferson and passed in 1786, became a model guaranteeing that no one could be compelled to attend or support any religious institution. The First Amendment to the Constitution prohibited Congress from establishing a national religion. This principle of religious freedom was revolutionary. In most of the world, governments still required religious conformity. The American system of religious freedom, combined with the lack of an established church, created a competitive religious marketplace that led to extraordinary religious diversity and vitality. The Revolution's international impact was equally profound. The success of the American Revolution inspired people throughout the world who lived under oppressive governments. It provided a working example that republican government was possible, contradicting claims that only monarchy could provide stable government. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, was directly influenced by the American example. Many French soldiers and officers, including the Marquis de Lafayette, had served in America and brought revolutionary ideas home. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen echoed the American Declaration of Independence. However, the French Revolution took a much more radical and violent course than the American Revolution, eventually producing dictatorship and European-wide warfare. Throughout Latin America in the early 19th century, independence movements drew inspiration from the American Revolution. Leaders like Simón Bolívar explicitly cited the American example as they fought to free Spanish colonies in South America. The Monroe Doctrine, proclaimed by President James Monroe in 1823, opposed European colonialism in the Americas and asserted American leadership in the Western Hemisphere. The Revolution also influenced political movements in Europe. The Belgian Revolution of 1830, the Greek War of Independence, and the 1848 revolutions across Europe all drew on ideas first articulated during the American Revolution. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, independence movements worldwide looked to America's founding as inspiration and precedent. The American Revolution established several key principles that have shaped modern political thought. The idea of popular sovereignty, that legitimate government authority comes from the people, has become fundamental to modern democracy. The concept of natural rights that governments must respect has influenced human rights movements worldwide. The model of a written constitution as fundamental law superior to ordinary legislation has been widely adopted. The system of federalism, dividing power between national and state governments, has influenced other large countries seeking to balance unity with diversity. However, we must acknowledge the limits and contradictions in the revolution's legacy. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, yet slavery continued and expanded. The Constitution created a democratic republic, yet the majority of the population, women, enslaved people, Native Americans, and even white men without property in some states could not vote. The revolution's ideals of liberty and equality applied primarily to white men of property. These contradictions would haunt American history. The tensions between slavery and freedom, federal and state power, and different visions of American identity would eventually erupt in the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. The struggle to extend the Revolution's promises of equality and rights to all Americans would continue through the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, the civil rights movement, and ongoing debates about equality and justice. The Revolution also initiated the dispossession of Native Americans that would continue throughout the 19th century. The Treaty of Paris had transferred vast territories to the United States without consulting the native peoples who lived there. In the decades after the Revolution, American expansion westward came at the expense of Native American tribes who were pushed off their lands through treaties, warfare, and forced removal. The Revolution's promise of liberty for some came at the cost of freedom and land for others. Economically, independence allowed the United States to develop its own economy free from British mercantilist restrictions. America could now trade freely with any nation, though British naval power still constrained American commerce. The new nation developed its own financial institutions, manufacturing base, and commercial networks. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the nation's size and provided vast resources for future development. Culturally, independence encouraged the development of a distinctive American identity. Americans began to produce their own literature, art, and scholarship rather than simply importing British culture. Noah Webster created an American dictionary to standardize American English spelling and usage. American painters like Charles Willson Peale and John Trumbull depicted revolutionary scenes and leaders. Writers began creating distinctly American literature, though this process took decades. The Revolution also influenced military thinking. The successful use of militia and irregular tactics against a professional army inspired later revolutionary movements. The idea that citizen soldiers defending their homes could defeat professional armies became powerful, though the reality was more complex. Washington's Continental Army succeeded partly because it became more professional over time, and French military and naval support was crucial to ultimate victory. The federal system created by the Constitution influenced later federal systems worldwide. Canada, Australia, Germany, and other nations adopted variations of federalism to balance national unity with regional diversity. The American model of constitutional review, where courts can declare laws unconstitutional, has also been widely adopted, though its implementation varies greatly across countries. Perhaps the Revolution's most enduring impact has been on political thought and discourse. The idea that governments exist to protect people's rights, that people have the right to alter or abolish governments that become tyrannical, and that political legitimacy derives from popular consent, have become fundamental principles of modern democracy. Even governments that violate these principles often pay them lip service, showing their power as ideals. The American Revolution transformed the political landscape. Before 1776, monarchy was the dominant form of government worldwide. Democracy was generally viewed as unstable and impractical, except in small city-states. The successful creation of a large democratic republic challenged these assumptions. While the United States was far from fully democratic by modern standards, excluding women, enslaved people, Native Americans, and often men without property from political participation, it was more democratic than most contemporary governments. The revolution also demonstrated that colonies could successfully rebel against imperial powers. This was not the first successful colonial rebellion, but it was the most significant and influential. The American example encouraged colonial independence movements for the next 2 centuries, contributing to the eventual collapse of European colonial empires. In American memory and identity, the Revolution holds a central place. The Founding Fathers have been elevated to semi-mythical status. Their images appear on currency, monuments, and in countless paintings and sculptures. Their words are quoted in political debates. Independence Day on July 4th is America's most important patriotic holiday. The Constitution is treated with reverence, housed in a special display in the National Archives. This reverence has both positive and negative aspects. On the positive side, it creates a shared national narrative and set of ideals that unite Americans across diverse backgrounds. The principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution provide standards against which to measure the nation's progress and failings. Movements for social justice have repeatedly invoked revolutionary principles, arguing that America must live up to its founding ideals. On the negative side, excessive reverence for the founders can make it difficult to critically examine their failures and limitations. The founders were products of their time who held beliefs many would now consider abhorrent. Many owned enslaved people. They excluded women from political rights. They viewed Native Americans as obstacles to white expansion. Acknowledging these failures does not diminish their real achievements, but provides a more complete and honest understanding of the revolution. The revolution's legacy continues to be debated and reinterpreted. Conservative Americans often emphasize the founders' concerns about limiting government power and protecting property rights. Progressive Americans emphasize the revolutionary ideals of equality and the people's right to create governments that serve their needs. These different interpretations reflect ongoing debates about the proper role of government, the meaning of equality, and the nature of American identity. The historiography of the Revolution, how historians have written about it, has evolved significantly. Early histories, often written by participants or their immediate descendants, treated the Revolution as a heroic struggle for liberty against tyranny. In the early 20th century, progressive historians emphasized economic conflicts and class interests. Mid-20th century historians focused on political ideas and constitutional principles. More recent scholarship has examined the experiences of groups previously marginalized in historical accounts: women, enslaved people, Native Americans, loyalists, and common soldiers. This newer scholarship has enriched our understanding while complicating simple narratives. The Revolution appears less as a unified struggle and more as a complex series of conflicts involving multiple groups with different interests and goals. This more complex view is probably more accurate, even if less emotionally satisfying than heroic narratives. As we reflect on the American Revolution from the perspective of over 2 centuries later, we can see both its tremendous achievements and its significant failures. The revolution created a new nation based on principles of popular sovereignty, individual rights, and constitutional government. These principles have influenced democratic movements worldwide and remain powerful ideals. The revolution demonstrated that people could successfully govern themselves without hereditary rulers. Yet the revolution also contained profound contradictions. It proclaimed equality while maintaining slavery. It spoke of rights while denying them to women and Native Americans. It created representative government while restricting political participation to white men with property. These contradictions would require generations to address, and some would argue they still remain. Perhaps the revolution's greatest legacy is not what it achieved, but what it promised. The principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution set standards that America has never fully met, but that provide a framework for continued progress. When Frederick Douglass argued against slavery, when suffragists demanded votes for women, when civil rights activists fought segregation, they invoked the revolution's promises of equality and rights. The revolution created a language of rights and equality that excluded many people, but that those excluded could use to demand inclusion. As we conclude this journey through the American Revolution, we've traced the path from the first stirrings of colonial resistance through 8 years of warfare to the creation of a new nation and the revolution's lasting impact. We've seen how ordinary people lived through these extraordinary times, how they struggled with fear, hardship, and uncertainty while trying to maintain normal life. The American Revolution was not inevitable. At many points, different decisions or events could have led to different outcomes. If Britain had pursued more conciliatory policies in the 1760s, the colonies might have remained in the empire. If the British had won key battles, the rebellion might have been crushed. If France had not entered the war, the Americans might have been unable to win independence. But history followed the path it did, and the American Revolution changed the world. It created the United States, which would grow into a major world power. It inspired democratic movements globally. It articulated principles of liberty, equality, and self-government that remain influential today. Yet the revolution also reminds us that grand principles can coexist with profound injustices, that proclaimed ideals often exceed actual practices, and that creating a more perfect union is an ongoing process, not a finished achievement. The American Revolution was both a fulfillment and a promise, an achievement and a beginning. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can imagine yourself in that revolutionary era, a farmer watching soldiers march past your field, a woman managing a household while her husband serves in the army, a soldier enduring a cold night in winter camp, a delegate in Philadelphia debating the shape of a new nation. These people, living through uncertain times, making difficult choices, doing their best with limited information, they were not so different from people today facing their own challenges. History reminds us that change is possible, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, and that the choices individuals and societies make matter. The American Revolution was made by imperfect people creating imperfect institutions, yet they created something that has lasted and adapted for over 200 years. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the American Revolution. I hope these stories from the past have provided both interest and relaxation as you prepare for rest. History flows like a great river, carrying us from the past through the present toward an unknown future. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of that continuing story.